This is Antic, the Atari 8-Bit Podcast. I'm Kay Savitz. Jim Titzler got my attention with a tweet, an old photo of a computer in a PC-style case connected to Atari joysticks and an Atari disk drive. In the tweet, Jim wrote, "A prototype of what we hoped would become the Atari 1600, an Atari 800 grafted onto an IBM PC compatible, a Jekyll and Hyde mashup allowing you to plug in cartridges, SIO drives, and PC expansion cards. It seemed like a good idea at the time." So I reached out to Jim to learn more about that computer and his time at Atari. Jim worked in Atari's Special Projects group, where he worked on several pie-in-the-sky unreleased home computer projects, including the Atari 1600. When Atari was sold to Jack Tramiel, he was rehired, where he worked on the Atari ST, the Atari PC-1 IBM compatible, and other projects. This interview took place on September 9th, 2020.
I never programmed until university, so I walked into the logo lab at MIT during, we have this IAP, independent activities period between the two semesters, where you get a month to effectively play. And I walked into the logo lab and I was astounded because there's these 10-year-old kids programming. And this was something so totally foreign to me. And I was hooked instantly. Career changed, or trajectory changed in one day, I think.
What was your plan before that?
Electrical power distribution and generation.
Oh, all right.
Totally. Well, electrical engineering and computer science are all in the same department, so it wasn't a hopeless switch, but right. It was a totally different trajectory. Yeah. I started off. My first job after university was working at Heath, of Heathkit fame, and worked in the computer group there, and had a lot of fun, and then moved on to a medical equipment startup where we did computer vision for automatic urinalysis, which was pretty cutting edge for 79, 80, along in there. The machine, which still exists today, but is now a desktop thing about the size of an espresso machine, it was a whole desk. It was built into a desk with a 68,000 processor and a real video camera and a microscope. It was quite an elaborate thing. And the reason I mentioned that is I sort of followed the same boss all along. My boss at Heathkit went to this startup, and I and a mechanical engineer joined him, and then later on, he went to Atari, and the mechanical engineer and I also followed in there.
Cool. And the boss was?
Larry Plummer.
Okay. Tell me how you ended up at Atari. You followed your boss there. What were they going to have you do, and how'd it go?
Well, I'm sure there's lots of versions of the story, but my version is that Atari had become a huge thing. When I joined, there were just shy of 10,000 people. There were 50 buildings. It was incredible. And I think there was a little bit of frustration about how rapidly new things were coming along. And so there was sort of this idea that we would set up a separate group inside the larger home computer division. And so we had the brief to sort of, do our own thing, almost like a startup within a bigger company, that whole concept. And so I worked on a variety of little things, from modems to different peripherals for the Atari 8-bit line. And we kept growing and growing. It was a great place to work, lots of benefits of working there. Incredible Christmas parties, that sort of thing. It was truly the Silicon Valley dream of the era, and I was having a lot of fun because I really believed in the whole home computer idea that this could really revolutionize how people were playing and getting entertainment and accessing services. So I thought it was great. We started doing more and more things. The 8-bit line was running its course. We built a prototype of essentially an Atari 8-bit computer grafted onto the side of a Sun 1 workstation. So it was a 68,000/6502 machine. It was a lot of fun to play with, but about that time, the IBM PC came out, and so management decided that they weren't really interested in this more esoteric 68,000 thing where you'd have to find a completely different set of software, and maybe it would be better to go along with doing the same thing only with an IBM PC as the base. And so we grafted a 6502 onto the side of an IBM PC compatible. And that took another year, and as you know, never shipped, but was a lot of fun to work on. It was a joint venture, and we worked with Toshiba. Toshiba at the time was interested in entering the US market, I think, in a bigger way, especially in the home. They had PCs that they were selling to businesses, but I think they were interested in the home market. Atari wanted a jump start into the IBM PC compatible world. Toshiba had a clean room BIOS. There were lots of advantages to this bi-directional sharing. And that was when I took my first business trip to Japan and decided that I really enjoyed living here. And so that was my first introduction. That would have been, what, 1983-ish, maybe 84, 83, I think, long in there. Mm-hmm. And it was an interesting machine. It was really two machines in one box. There was a certain amount of sharing. The peripherals could essentially live on their native bus. And so the IBM PC had all of its native peripherals. The Atari had SIO and all of its native peripherals, the cartridge slot, all the things you expect in the Atari 8-bit world. And then there was bidirectional communication between the two with interrupts or optionally DMA, so that you could actually boot the Atari from the IBM PC disk drive because there was fancy control of the floppy disk controller and firmware inside the PC side. What was normally the BIOS also contained firmware that was like service routines for the Atari side. So you could, effectively copy from a floppy into the PC memory and then have the 8088 copy it across into the Atari's side. Huh. It really was two machines, is what I'm boiling it down to.
Did it feel like two machines? I mean, would you have to switch between I'm looking at the 6502 and I'm looking at the PC thing, or were they?
No. Well, if you were comfortable with television resolution, then you could display it through the Atari 8-bit output. And so you could do like the low resolution, what was CGA low resolution, 320, 240, I think, 320, 200, along in there somewhere. Mm-hmm. Anyway, at lower resolution than the Atari 8-bit. And so you could theoretically use one monitor, one television theoretically, and display either side. But you were only looking at one at a time. It wasn't, there was no sense of like you could have two windows open into different worlds at the same time.
Okay. But they could pass data between them.
Exactly. Yes.
So
but
you could,
the data that it was, well, at the point where we were, it was just like service data. So like if you wanted to print, the Atari could copy stuff into the 8088's interprocessor communication registers. The 8088 would pull it out and send it to the Centronics printer port on the back of the IBM PC. So it was all sort of service level stuff. We never got to the point where there was any real symbiosis between the two processors. It was really like two different worlds.
So you posted a picture of one of these machines on Twitter. How many were made? Was this the only one? Was it more than that?
Well, I think there's a couple of different revisions. There was a prototype, which, to the best of my knowledge, there were only two in the world probably. I think it was really an IBM PC clone with what was effectively an Atari 800 on a PC bus card with some holes and slots drilled in the side of the case so that you could have additional Atari peripherals. And then later on, that was refined into a real PC board. But in the interest of reducing costs, the IBM PC bus went away because that had a whole bunch of, among other things, size and power requirements that we didn't want to have to deal with. What else went away? I can't think of anything right off, but it did get further reduced, and there were PC boards made for what this was going to become as a marketable product. But then I don't know how many of those were actually made. I would guess 10, just enough to do software development on both sides.
Do you think this would have been a marketable product if it had arrived at the right time? Was this something that people needed?
I don't know. I think it would have been an interesting entree into the home market for what we were trying to do. We had time constraints. There's lots of things that we wanted to do that we didn't get around to. For example, the whole interprocessor communication thing was implemented with a whole handful of logic that was someday going to become another custom chip to cost reduce and reduce the size of the board, because there was an awful lot involved there. And we had some goals for video that never played out that were going to allow better integration of higher resolution. But again, that was going to be like the next machine, not this one. So I think it could have been, but this would have had to have been seen as like the first step in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
I was more excited, I think, about the 68,000 machine, merely because at my previous job at the medical startup, we had used a 68,000 processor. I was really impressed at its performance and how easy it was to program, the regularity of it compared to an 8088. And so I suppose I was really pulling for that one. But there's also another thing that we need to think about, and that was at this era, few people were doing programming by the official APIs. To get performance, you often cheated, and that happened on both the Atari side and the IBM side. And so if somebody didn't go through all of the appropriate actions to write a character to the screen on either side, it meant you ended up having to do a certain amount of trickery, and there was an awful lot going on trying to actually emulate the video system of the other side on each side. So there were a lot of trade-offs involved. It was great for programs where people followed the approved API, wrote BIOS calls to do all the graphics, whatever. But in practice, there was a lot going on.
Right. And hackers and game programmers never want to do that anyway, follow the APIs.
Exactly.
Follow the rules, right?
Especially at that era. I remember there was a whole separate slew of logic that we did, because one of the things we learned in the 68,000/6502 world was the problem of getting characters from the keyboard into the Atari 8-bit side. And so we actually had a bunch of custom, well, at this stage, it was random logic that allowed the IBM PC to effectively press a key in a virtual matrix on Pokey. So that's how the machine actually typed. The keyboard was a typical PC keyboard, and then the 8088 would close the appropriate place on the matrix to make it appear in the Atari side, so that all that was compatible.
Huh. So that you said the 68,000 machine was more interesting to you because you had more familiarity with that
exactly
chip yourself.
Yes.
Yeah.
And admittedly, it was connected to a Sun 1 workstation, and so it had spectacular graphics compared to what we were going to be able to ship to at a consumer home price level.
You had mentioned before all this, you had worked on some peripherals for the Atari 8-bits. Do you remember which ones and what you did with them?
Not a lot. One of them was the modem. I remember I demonstrated that we could dial DTMF without having to add a hardware chip to do DTMF by synthesizing the sine waves. What else? Later on, after all of this, there was an 80 character adapter for the Atari 8-bit stuff.
Right, the XEP80. Right.
No, before that. This was like trying to get it onto a TV with grayscale, and it never shipped. So those are the ones I can remember. But the trackball. I mentioned the aforementioned mechanical engineer. He was one of the people that worked on the trackball, and so we were sharing an office, and so I played around with that. But that was just a quick one from my point of view.
Nice. Well, you need that trackball to play Missile Command.
Yeah, Atari was fun. We had, I don't know how much you've already discussed working at Atari, but there were
tell me everything.
Coin-op games and just off the lobby of most of the buildings, or many of the buildings. And so I got really good at Tempest and a variety of Atari video games, because you could just, at lunchtime or after work or something, go in there and play to your heart's content.
Neat. Did you ever see the executive dining room?
Only twice, I think, in my, how long was it until Tramiel came along? Maybe 3 years? I think twice. One of them was about one of the meetings with about the what was going to be the 1600.
Did you ever see the hot
tub? In fact,
tub?
we moved. We were originally in North San Jose at along First Street. That's where I joined Atari in 1981. And we were there for a long time. And during that time, Atari grew up to like 10,000 people. And then they started doing layoffs, and a lot of people started leaving, and we shrank away. Eventually, Atari Research Labs, I think, was closed completely, maybe in late 83, early 84. I don't know the timeline, but along in there. And that's when the remaining ones of us from the home computer division ended up moving into their old building. There on Borregas, very near the executives.
The only hard dates I have for you is you joined Atari in about March 1981, and then Atari established the Advanced Engineering Group in March 83, and I think you were part of that early on. But I don't
recognize that name, but it could well be. I think we were called, the name I knew was Special Projects Group.
Okay.
But that was the whole, tiny company inside a big company concept.
Right.
But in practice, that never made a big deal, because we ended up working with, people across the company, across the home computer division. I never met anybody from the research group. I never met anybody from the Coin-op group. It was all quite insular.
And did you ever see the hot tub?
No. I went to Grass Valley once. Does that count?
Yeah,
sure. That was fun. Pretty.
Tell me about that.
Pretty laid back and hippie style. Who was the vice president? Dave Steuben.
Okay.
Who's a private pilot, and so flew me up to Grass Valley to talk about graphics, processors, and things, but nothing ever came of that particular project. So, but it was interesting to see. I was so far down. I mean, Atari at the era had many layers of directors, presidents, vice presidents, executive vice presidents. So I didn't have a good view of the entire company. I had my own little world.
Yeah, it was bloated with middle management for sure.
Well, yeah, but just the fact that it was also well spread out. There was a research lab in New York that we would hear about occasionally, but never really interacted with. There were the folks at Grass Valley, similarly for me anyway. The people at Atari Research, I never saw anything come out of them. I know they were working. I think they also had an 8088 or 8086/8-bit machine, but the development was completely parallel, and I only found out about it after ours had been canceled. So that was rather frustrating as an engineer. Mm-hmm. I don't understand the whole management philosophy, but as an engineer, that was incredibly frustrating to find out that within the company, there had been a second parallel project.
I bet. So were there any other projects that you worked on that maybe didn't go anywhere, or just crazy ideas? Anything you can recall that?
Nothing major. There was after this Shakti/1600 was canceled, Atari was shrinking so rapidly. I was pretty much left on my own to explore things, and I came up with a project to build like a two-part computer, a portable computer with an LCD screen and a set-top box that it would dock to. But that also never shipped. That one only partially made it to prototype stage before that project got wound down. Okay. But the idea was you'd have something that you could take off into your lap and sit on your couch, and it was fully functional on its own. It had an LCD display and battery power, although in that era the batteries wouldn't have lasted terribly long, but that was one of the many problems. And then if you wanted to, you could dock it with a thing that sat atop your television, had an RF modulator in it, and could give you a bigger display.
Huh.
Guess it was more like the Dynabook concept. The idea was the portable thing would have built-in software that the user at that level might not see as a computer. It was more an appliance. And then it became a computer when you attached it to the dock, which had more peripherals. Because of the era, the portable part was just barely a human interface, right? You could run like maybe a notepad sort of thing or a spreadsheet sort of thing, although I don't think we called it a spreadsheet, but like some, calculation sort of thing. But it became a computer then when you mushed it all together.
Neat. Seems amazing.
That was also 68,000 based. Fortunately, none of this stuff got thrown away immediately. And so when the Tramiels bought Atari and were trawling through all of the old engineering notes, they found that. And that's what got me my interview to work at the new Atari. That was quite strange. I thought I had a job, but then they came in and interviewed me for my job, which was an exciting day.
Yeah, tell me about that. What was it like with the change over to the Tramiels?
Well, I at my level as an engineer, it was exciting because we were extremely focused for the next 6 months. That 6 months after the Tramiel purchase was absolutely fantastic as an engineer. We were working astounding hours, making what I thought was huge strides in a short period of time for 5 to 8 of us, depending upon how you count. And it was just fabulous. So after riding Atari from over 10,000 people down to a few hundred, it was spectacular to have such a focus, to know that the company was counting on this thing to ship, that this wasn't going to be another project that I would be frustrated by. It was fabulous as an engineer.
And this was the PC?
No, the ST, the RBP.
Okay.
That was my connection. Is the 68,000 of all of the people I guess left at Atari, I had 68,000 hardware experience, and that's what got me the interview.
Oh, right, working on the ST, right? And what was your role on the ST? What were you working
on? Little bits of everything. I was in the hardware group, even though I'm more of a software engineer. So I designed some of the peripherals, like the keyboard. The keyboard was microcontroller was programmed by a couple of guys from Atari Japan who came over for 2 or 3 months and worked in our lab. I wrote the first software that ever ran on an ST, first software that ever ran on a TT, because I was the softest of the hardware group, doing the hardware bring up after we'd wire wrap the prototype, trying to get it running, finding out if it was running, that sort of thing. Blinking an LED was always an exciting moment in the birth of a new computer.
I think it still is.
I'm sure it is. It's just I'm more removed from that nowadays.
Sure. And I read that you also worked a little bit on the Atari PC-1.
Oh yeah, but again, at sort of the architectural level, I at this point had become quite conversant with what made a compatible PC, and I worked with John Honig, who did an amazing custom chip that put together almost all of this stuff into one chip. So we were able to build a pretty inexpensive computer that would fit into an existing housing, so we didn't have to build more tooling. So that was fun, but nothing innovative on my side. John did all of the innovation, taking what we thought was the bare minimum for hardware compatibility and implementing it as a chip.
How did your time at Atari come to an end?
Well, in 1990, I moved to Japan because I was traveling to Atari Taiwan and Atari Japan relatively often. I got involved, among other things, in getting the Atari portfolio into production. And so I built some of the little peripherals that docked onto the portfolio and some of the software. And I think technically I was product manager, which mostly meant I was the go-between between the people at DIP and Atari and manufacturing, which happened here in Japan. And so I enjoyed living in Japan. I enjoyed visiting Japan, I guess. And I suppose the actual impetus of moving here was getting the ST book into production. That was being fabricated here in Japan by a third-party factory. And so I was working on test fixtures and things of that sort. And it was an opportune time to get a chance to try living in Japan for a year or two. Mm-hmm. And that was obviously 30 years ago now.
And you're still in Japan, is that right?
Yes. Yep.
Neat. So the portfolio, that must have been exciting to be part of a project that actually shipped.
I think the portfolio is quite cool. I still have 2 or 3 of them, one of which is still being used, which is kind of amusing because it's like this always-on spreadsheet. It makes it really easy. It's just a no-brainer sort of thing. But yeah, I thought it was an astounding machine for its time.
Yeah.
First, really, I thought practical, pocketable PC. Mm-hmm. I was really impressed by the Scion, which predated the portfolio a little bit. But I thought that portfolio brought together more things. It brought together this whole PC compatibility, and I thought it was great.
Yeah, no,
but
is great.
I had nothing to do with its design. That was all acquired from a company in the UK.
Right. Yeah. But you helped with the add-on peripherals and things.
And getting it into production, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Nice. So you said you're still using one. What is it being used for?
Just a spreadsheet. Yeah. It's a way that I quickly enter some numbers that I keep track of daily.
Nice. Cool.
It's just for fun, right? It's a link to nostalgia. That we have a Tokyo Retro Computing Club.
Really?
Which is the same sort of thing. It's this link to nostalgia. There's a huge number of folks here that are really interested in the variety of MSX machines, which never really made it huge in the US, but were huge here.
Yeah.
Which they all have their little quirks and their little added peripherals. And there are folks in this group that can quote chapter and verse on the advantage of each. It's a lot of fun.
I'm sure there's holy wars about which one is better, right?
Totally.
Right.
Just as in the Atari Commodore wars, there are, my MSX is better than yours. But then there's just collectors. We have an awful lot of folks that just want to have one of everything. So that's also amusing. I try and avoid that, but I admire their collection.
But you still attend the meetings and.
Well, I've only attended a couple, but yes.
Yeah.
It's fun.
Nice. That's great. I'm glad that we here in the U.S. do not have a monopoly on retro computing nerdiness.
Yes, I've always wanted to go to one of the vintage computer fests, but I've yet to make it. To go to the UK last year for something totally unrelated and made it my pilgrimage to the Museum of Computing History. What's the museum attached to Bletchley Park called?
Right. I don't know what it's called, but I know what you're
Museum
talking
of Computing History or something along
Mhm.
of that sort, and was quite astounded that you can walk down the hall from these hallowed machines, and there's an Atari 800 and there's an Atari ST. It's not quite at the same level of display, but it still was amusing to be in the same building.
Right. Nice. What do you do today?
I'm semi-retired. I still contribute to some open source projects. I provide some consulting on a very limited basis to a couple of startups, but basically I'm retired.
Cool. All right. So I feel like I might have missed something about your Atari times. What haven't I asked you about your time at Atari that I should have?
I don't know. I had a lot of fun. It was great. Maybe 10 years? And so there were some frustrating times. The Warner times ended up being frustrating. We had a lot of resources as engineers, but at least from my limited perspective, it was incredibly frustrating because few of the things that I actually worked on made it to market. But at the same time, we had access to a lot of equipment, prototyping, that sort of thing that I probably wouldn't have had at a smaller company. And then in the Tramiel era, the absolute most fabulous thing was that first 6-9 months where the group was so incredibly focused. Shiraz, Shivji isolated us from Jack and Sam and everything. So we just got down to it and did the engineering, and it was an astounding period of time in my engineering career because it was so incredibly focused. I don't think at the time, I've now found out how dangerously close to bankruptcy we were and how, Jack's resources were quite finite and we were pushing those. But at the time, we thought we were doing great getting this thing done that quickly. We didn't realize how much pressure there could have been if we'd only known.
Well, the machine was done in an amazingly short amount of time, and it's something to be proud of for sure.
It was a fun machine. A lot of different things came together. And it took off in ways we weren't sure it would do. Like the whole MIDI thing. The fact that MIDI really caught on was, I think we thought it would be cool, but I don't think we realized that there would be a certain subgroup of musicians that would really latch on to that one particular feature.
Right. If you could send a message to the Atari community that still exists, and you can right now, what would you tell them? What would you tell them?
I don't know. I think the community is so varied. I think that's one of the things that the retro computing forums and clubs have taught me is that people are interested in different stuff. So, find your niche and just enjoy. There's still, I think, stuff to be explored in these machines, and they have the advantage that they're small enough that you can actually get your head around. I don't think I could understand what's in the PC that I'm using right now, but I understood absolutely everything about an Atari ST or an Atari 800. That fits my brain. Modern machine, I don't think I would not be able to fit the entire thing. I'd have to, find some specialty and work there. So I guess the thing I'd say to the community is take advantage of the fact that you've got something that you can fit your brain around and, find your niche.
Mm-hmm. When you put the tweet out there, which is how I found you, you posted the photo of this machine. I assume that photo was taken many years ago. And
oh yeah, it's an old faded Polaroid that I just happened to come across as we recently moved, and I was sorting things, and so I found those.
People got excited. People were on Twitter, came out of the woodwork to ask you questions and wanted to know about it. It seemed like.
Yeah, it's fun. I'm glad that there's people still interested in this stuff 40 years or 35 years later.
Mm-hmm.
It's great.
Thank you for your time.
Nice to meet you.